Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now today I'm speaking with Jamie Taylor. Jamie, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Hi Dan, how you doing?
I'm really well. It's great to have you on, and we're going to be talking about talent development, and specifically we're going to be talking about the research you've conducted on why it is high potential players don't make it. And that's going to be really fascinating. I'm fascinated because I do a lot of work with young players, and I'm certainly keen to learn about the kind of things, the kind of obstacles that they have. But look, before we do, why don't you take a little time to introduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience?
Yeah, thanks very much. I suppose my background is pretty potted, really. At heart, I'm a coach. I'm a PE teacher. Really just with a heartfelt passion for helping people get better, and that probably brings me to where I am now, along with having a real desire to help people get better themselves. I've just got a real interest with understanding the process of human performance, really. My previous role before now was as head academy coach at Leicester Tigers. I now work in the Pathways team at the English Institute of Sport. I suppose my role is pretty varied, no 2 days the same, but in essence my role is to support Olympic, Paralympic talent pathways to develop their practice in talent development.
What does that look like on a day-to-day basis? What kind of things might you engage in?
Oh, incredibly varied. Probably not, I mean, as I said, there are no 2 days the same, but a particular area of focus for me is helping sports shape the experience of athletes and supporting the development of coaching practice.
And you were head of academy for Leicester Tigers. What approach did you take there? Did you introduce quite a lot of pracademic stuff there? Did you lead from a pracademic perspective? Were you quite evidence based when you led at Leicester Tigers?
Yeah, absolutely. I think my evolution as a coach has been heavily influenced by my academic work and by the people who have supported me in my academic life. I don't necessarily see a significant difference between academia and practice. Ultimately, if academia and practice are doing things in a productive way, they should be speaking to each other. They should be one and the same, rather than something over here and something over there. So yes, my practice has always been fundamentally impacted by my academic work, and growing more and more so.
Growing more so. One of the things I was keen to talk to you about today on the show was the paper that you wrote about high potential players, and specifically why they don't make it. It's neatly titled Shoulda, Coulda, Didn't, or Didna. I think have I got to affect a Scottish accent when I actually pronounce that?
I think you're better doing it than I am.
Probably not. Horrendous Scottish accent. But I didn't. I couldn't. I shouldn't. I didn't. Why don't high potential players make it? Why don't high potential players make it is the title of the paper. And this was a piece of research you did alongside Dave Collins from University of Central Lancashire.
Yes, and both now moved to Edinburgh.
Okay. And so I'd love to talk about this paper, and I'd love to learn a little bit about your findings. But what was the background, Jamie, to this? Why were you interested in researching this area?
So, well, this paper forms part of a PhD that's investigating the evolution of excellence through talent pathways, and there's some further work in the pipeline. But essentially, we've been looking to understand the experiences of developing performers, what they bring to those experiences, and how those experiences shape their development. There's a significant body of literature out there that looks at those that have made it. And the danger with looking at those that have made it are you end up with a very small group of people. And there's, I suppose, there's a phenomenon called survivorship bias, where you can end up with drawing conclusions from a very small group of people that then just perpetuates existing practice. There's a paper by Holton Mitchell, 2006. I'm happy to send these references. That was the only one that we're aware of that had previously looked at failure through a talent pathway. So this was an opportunity really to look at retrospectively players who were perceived to be very high potential, or those that coaches felt like they were definitely going to make it, but then ended up falling away for whatever reason.
Interesting. And so it's very much retrospective. And what did the research consist of? What specific participants did you have, and how did you go about? Was it an interview process? How did you go about conducting the research?
Yeah. So I think it's important to say that my research paradigm, along with Dave's, is that we're pragmatic in that we prioritise methods that we feel are practically meaningful, rather than holding true to a really tight way of doing things. So we recruited 2 samples of very highly experienced talent development coaches at the highest level of professional academies in rugby and football. 10 of which each. So I interviewed rugby coaches, Dave interviewed the football coaches, and we asked them to reflect on 3 players who they'd worked with, who fitted the criteria. And I suppose the important bit here is that they were perceived to be high potential in the first place. We're not talking about general public, we're talking about people who relatively early in their talent development journey were showing signs of being very high potential, and then interviewed them to understand why they fell away.
Okay. And what kind of, may I ask what, I don't know if you recollect, but what kind of questions might that have incorporated? How was it split up in any way? So without wanting to get too stuck into research methodology, there were semi-structured interviews that asked them to reflect on their views about talent development, their experiences in talent development, a number of probing questions to probe about the histories of the athletes that fell away. Okay. What were the results? What did you learn from that? I believe there were sort of 5, having read the paper myself, there were 5 things that heavily mediated whether the athlete made it, or the reasons why they didn't make it.
Yeah, so there were clearly a lot of reasons why, or at least a lot of reasons why the coaches attributed failure to these players. Okay. And we grouped them into 5 areas, and I suppose it wouldn't surprise you that the key area was or at least a lack of mental skills across a variety of areas, predominantly being either commitment or motivationally based. There were also some serendipitous factors, or just bad luck, whether that was other players getting in the way, whether it was injuries at the wrong time, that sort of thing. There are also system failures, which I think have some, we can probably talk about that later, but some really interesting and implications for talent pathways, some maladaptive family input, and a small group of them, and no surprise really that this was focused in the rugby cohort, but lacking specific physical characteristics necessary.
Okay, all right. Yeah, this will be great to strip back, because I just think this is absolutely fascinating. So, as you said, it sounds to me like one of the primary factors was lacking mental skills. And if we break this down, what I read in your research was, it sounded like you said there was a motivational piece there, but also coping skills and self-regulation skills. These players, despite their ability, we might call it a tactical ability, the reality was they didn't necessarily have or obtain the coping and self-regulation skills. That was something that really shone through in the article.
Yes, absolutely. And I suppose in addition, that's a lack of mental skills, such as a self-regulatory one, prevented them from making the technical tactical improvements necessary in order to reach the very highest levels rather than competing well at junior levels.
It's interesting. One of the things you wrote about was the coaches said something about the need for praise. There were players who had who relied on praise.
Yes, that was certainly one comment made by a coach in the interview, or that they weren't able to cope when things got a little bit tougher. That they were constantly relying on positive feedback from all corners. And as we well know, development of talent is pretty non-linear, and that if you are going to reach the top, hard times are likely to come and may also benefit you if they come. And if a young athlete, developing athlete, and I mean athlete rather than just player, progresses through a pathway without experiencing difficulty and the skills to be able to overcome those difficulties, then they are put at risk.
And so when you reflect on these results, these findings, and when you think back to being an academy manager yourself, what implications do you think they have? What if you were still an academy manager and you were looking at these? What would there be anything that you would implement or do differently?
Well, I would suggest that it's really important to understand where the player is or where the athlete is. And not just on the basis of performance, that we need to understand a far broader range of things about a young person. And we can't just assume that because somebody is doing really well now at a relatively easy level of performance, that they're going to continue in that manner. Now, I would suggest that if somebody was performing at the level that some of these players were identified as performing, that there are important steps that academies should be taking in order to both challenge them more and also equip them with the skills necessary to be able to cope with those challenges in a reverse order. So ensure that they're going to be able to cope with the challenge that you're going to put in front of them, and then make things a little bit tougher for them. Because no matter what, those challenges are going to come.
What can that look like in practice, Jamie?
So I think of interest, and this isn't in the paper, but the differences between rugby and football are very interesting in that football academies, in the way that they are set up, offer far more opportunity to rigorously and thoroughly periodised challenge in the way that we're discussing. Rugby, there are a few more barriers to being able to challenge early high performers because of both regulation and also because young players don't tend to come into a full-time setup until a little bit later on. But I would strongly suggest that, number one, really understand where that young person is. Mm-hmm. Not just from the perspective of, right, they're doing really well, so let's chuck them into something really hard. Because just as we highlighted in the paper that too little challenge was a barrier and a low level of coping skills was a barrier, as was too much challenge. So there were examples of players that had a very easy path and then suddenly got subjected to an adult level of high performance, and they never returned from that challenge. So the progressive part is really important. Understanding where the athlete is really important. And it could be, and I suppose the critical bit for me is that given where young people are on talent pathways, the small things can make enormous differences. And where a coach might say something that can elicit enormous emotional reaction that they don't even notice. So again, working with people around a young performer, parents, other members of staff, is really important to understand emotional reactions. So those challenges can be really simple. They could just be going and training with a higher group. They could just be playing out of position for a couple of games. But the key bit is maximising on the emotional reaction that they get from that challenge and working with either the positive or the negative and then allowing them some time to recover from it.
So, listening to you there, I'm thinking about the importance of coach skill set, the capacity to set activities that stretch players. That, I mean, obviously, you, as you've alluded to, you can play up an age group. Tough in rugby, I'm guessing. Again, as you mentioned, but you can create tough to achieve activities with tough challenge points or high challenge points. So the activities you set, that's part of your coaching skill, as well as the capacity to help players manage themselves through those activities. So coaching skills sort of cries out at me as a real important ingredient in this process. Yes,
absolutely. And I suppose a key bit for me here is that this is conceptualizing coaching beyond the pitch, beyond the track. It's about managing the process of performance development. And coaches need to think a lot more broadly than run here, do this, or thinking about skill acquisition. We have to think about really holistically about the development of performers. I suppose I'd also add that I gave the example of playing up, but very often, and this is the important bit, is performers' experience of that is critical, because playing up could be deemed not to be a challenge in many ways, because yes, the game might be harder, but the expectations that I take into that situation might be very low. Therefore, it might even be felt to be easier than playing in my current age group. There's also a status thing of, I'm thinking particularly of football academies, there's a status thing with playing up.
Okay, so it can be deemed to be so positive that it actually strips back the advantages of doing so. It actually it isn't really a challenge point.
Yes, and I think that's where it's the emotional reaction that's the important bit, rather than the event itself. Okay. So one piece of negative feedback could have a really profound impact on somebody, whereas playing down, them scoring 10 goals in a game, isn't necessarily going to have that same reaction. So to me, it's about the level and intensity of emotion that's provoked by an experience, rather than the experience itself.
As you're speaking, I'm picturing coaches sitting down to write their activities, and I'm thinking about coaches looking beyond the X's and the O's, and thinking about the impact that the activities they create have on players, how they communicate with them, their body language, their co-coaching if there's 2 or 3 of them, all of the, I suppose I would call, as a sports psychologist, the psychosocial aspects are so important, and that's being brought to life by your paper. By saying, your findings are basically crying out and saying, well, you know what, these players are potentially not making it for this reason, through a lack of mental skills. In terms of, you're in a position where you've worked as a head of academy within rugby. You're working for the English Institute of Sport. Do you feel that landscape is changing? Do you feel that coaches across sports are starting to become attuned to the importance of the psychosocial parts of the game, if you like?
I don't think I've seen many coaches that are not attuned to the need, or at least the psychosocial or the psychobehavioural dimensions of performance not being important. Where I think that, and this isn't a comment on any particular environment or any, sure. This is a very, very general comment.
Of course.
I would suggest that in many cases, coaches and environments aren't necessarily equipped to be able to do anything about the psychobehavioural or psychosocial side. And very often, I think there's been an over-reliance on psychologists to do the psychology, and not enough on changing practice across all levels. That's a very general observation.
So the coach coach doing psychology within his or her role, but actually really doing it, rather than just saying and being insistent on, well, I'm the coach, I'm the head coach, I'm the sports psychologist, or I'm the psychologist. Actually, that is factually correct, but actually engaging in a process of education and self-improvement in this area.
Yes, and I suggest that no matter what coaches are doing psychology, just as they're doing every other dimension of performance, it's probably more about having the ability and the confidence with which to shape it optimally for the developing performer is the bit that coaches, I think, can focus more on in their development.
Also, came to you before we move on to the next piece, within the mental skills. Obviously there was a motivational piece and coaches commenting on money. There seemed to be a difference between football and rugby in terms of how wealth, money is perceived and how it's utilised as a motivator. In football, it sounded like could be a distraction in terms of the future, whereas from a social perspective, money within rugby was perceived as something that holds young players back because they can come from this wealthy background. There was an interesting dynamic there.
Yes, in the football examples, it was perceived by coaches that there was a significantly maladaptive impact that money had on the motivational status of a young performer, particularly as they got to the sharper end when money starts becoming more prevalent, that life starts getting a bit easier. And there was a significant amount of comment about that. In the rugby sense, it was, well, the financial levels are very different, but young players that didn't want for anything were perceived to not to have lower levels of motivation than those that didn't.
Okay, so you think that money can be a heavy mediator for somebody else? It leads to distracted behaviours, essentially.
It potentially could.
Potentially.
Not certainly doesn't necessarily cause, but it has the potential to.
Absolutely, fair enough. Interesting serendipity. What do you mean by that? Just he just didn't make it. It was just one of those things.
So serendipity is effectively, it means good luck. So serendipity is when we're talking about serendipitous factors. So impact of luck on progression. So one particular rugby player, there was a club with several world-class players in his position that blocked his ability to progress and get the opportunities that his level of potential and performance warranted, and as a result just didn't get the level of developmental experience that he needed, and he ended up falling away. Similar in football, players getting crowded out by players who are in the same position, and others that just got injured at the wrong time. So whether that was before national squad selections or serious injury leading up to and missing key windows of developmental opportunity.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's very pertinent for modern day football, certainly in the English Premier League. Young players not being given the opportunity necessarily because of the first team philosophies. And yeah, you do wonder sometimes if there's no causal explanation for the difference between success and failure other than, hey look, there were just some really good players in this person's position and they didn't get the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose it's worth highlighting that was only across 5 out of the 60 players that we were talking about as well, or at least perceived by coaches to be.
And what does that mean to you?
It certainly means to me that the coaches didn't necessarily perceive it to be a really significant factor, but at the same time, something we've got to be really aware of, and that it's not as simple. I suppose I hope the message that I'm getting across here is it's not as simple as they're just not working hard enough. It's a lot more complex and a lot deeper than that.
there can be some factors that are within their control and out of their control, and it's focusing on the things that are within everybody's control and trying to maximise those things.
Definitely, and I think the other important point you make there is within everybody's control, not necessarily just the players.
Do you want to expand on that?
Well, I suppose it leads nicely into the idea of system-related factors that coaches talked about there being too little challenge, too much challenge, a lack of support from coaches, or a lack of opportunity being facilitated, not through bad luck, but a lack of planning and a lack of foresight by the academy. That the experiences that we offer athletes are critical to their development. That's the point of the concept of periodising challenge that Dave Collins and Anya McNamara have put forward. Just as much as it matters what the individual brings to that experience. It's not one or the other, it's both ends.
Interesting. So in essence, listening to what you're saying there, I'm thinking we're all culpable, we're all involved, there's an integrated process. I'm almost hearing attribution here. There's not, I've found in my work over the last 15, 20 years, the easy propensity for coaches to externalise attribution, it's the player. Whereas if a coach or group of coaches attribute the system, they look at the system, they give themselves the opportunity to be involved or attribute themselves as heavy mediators of the individual's success.
Yes, and I think there's a real danger for coaches is that very often psychological factors are deemed as not shiftable. So the extent to which somebody is committed can be seen as a permanent trait rather than a characteristic, something that can be changed if worked on. Now, I think that's a real, I suppose there's another message for me is that it's not necessarily good enough for a coach to say, look, this player isn't committed. We should be looking at levels of the extent to which change can take place, and then therefore how does change take place? What are the environmental conditions, and what does the support network look like around that, and how motivated is the performer to change as well?
I love that, because when I think about personality characteristics as you're speaking there, and you think about, say, a player working hard enough, which could align itself with the personality trait of conscientiousness, if we're thinking about the big five personality traits. And if I, as an individual sports psychologist, am brought in to help a player work harder, if you like, be on time, be more high conscientious, be more orderly, would be two of the facets of conscientiousness, then absolutely I can strive to help that individual, and we can co-create some solutions. Whereas if we think of that in terms of the system, where a group around that player help that player co-create solutions with that player and implement them across the system, then that's more of a juggernaut approach. It's more of a powerful approach where we can really get some shift in that person's characteristics, if you like.
Yes, but I'm no personality psychologist. But I suppose I'm always wary of putting people in boxes. And I mean, for example, I might be highly conscientious when it comes to this work, but hoovering and doing the dishes, I'm less conscientious about. I'm not. I suppose I don't feel like I'm in a position to specifically on personality, but yes, the reason why I refer to them as characteristics rather than traits is that I think that they can be shifted. It's a matter of understanding how they're going to be shifted and the level of effort that will be required to shift a given characteristic, which is why they need to be focused on early and not left until it's too late.
No, absolutely, and we're in complete agreement. I mean, people have typical responses in general. So you'll have a typical response that puts you higher or lower on, say, a conscientiousness scale. However, environment heavily mediates. So I would completely concur with what you're saying, and I am capable, and the coaches around me are capable of influencing that environment to influence the response of the player, and so subsequently personality is absolutely, the characteristics, if you like, are shiftable. But I also think it's recognising what a typical response may be from a competitor, a participant, if you like, because whilst these traits, these characteristic traits, are shiftable and malleable, people may always fall back to the typical, if you like. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I think there's also, when we consider the nature of coaching practice going beyond the pitch, or wherever coaching takes place, that there is a group of people around a young performer that will have profound influences on how they respond to whatever experiences they have. I think that's a really interesting element of. I certainly think that's probably, well, it's leading into the next pieces of work, but a really interesting dimension, something to consider.
Another mediating factor was maladaptive family input. Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yes, so this was a relatively highly identified area, that whether it was wider family coming up with poor piece of advice for the athlete, whether it was families that prevented engagement with challenge and the growth that become as a result of being through a high challenge experience, whether it was pre-existing patterns of parenting that led to the identified, the term we used was spoiled child, right, or business involvement by family members. No surprise that that's in football, or at the other end, parents who are completely driving and motivating development rather than the rugby player or the footballer.
Absolutely. Quite often these things are done out of the best will in the world and love. However, quite often those behaviours, those parental behaviours, can get in the way.
Yes, absolutely. It's a very, very difficult balance there. I know that as a parent myself. But I fundamentally, talent pathways have a responsibility to work with and through family, and they can't be treated as somebody over there or seen as somebody who gets in the way. That parents need to be worked with for exactly the reasons that we've identified.
You've mentioned you're a parent, and please answer this in any way you feel comfortable. Given what you know and the area you work in, let's hypothetically say my 8-year-old loves playing soccer and just so happens to be perceived as good at that age, and I understand that there's no direct correlation with moving on and getting better, but how would you advise a parent of that young participant to act, to behave, to go about their sports parenting style?
Oof, now you've really got me off the beaten track.
Sorry.
So I think there is. I think there's a risk of ending up at one end or the other. The end that drives an 8-year-old to perform, and their whole life becomes around football, which is where parent drives development. At the other end, it's just enjoy it, just turn up. And I think I would, and I'm certainly not in this situation, nor do I think I will be in this situation in 3 or 4 years' time. But I would imagine there's a real opportunity, especially in talent pathways, for young people to learn from experiences that they wouldn't otherwise be getting in a normal day-to-day life. That if appropriately debriefed, there was a real opportunity for them to develop a range of skills going to support them more broadly in whatever they choose to do in their life. And I hope, very well, I hope that I'll be, as a parent, if I was in that situation, that I'd be able to facilitate some of that.
I'm going to tell you, there's a lot of conversation about this on various podcasts and on the Twitter forums and other social media platforms. This notion of early specialisation and I suppose from a simple perspective, taking your sport too seriously too young, the adultification of sport, if you like. There's a lot of strong, very emotional opinions around this, and I suppose where I stand, Jamie, is very much on free agency, I suppose, a typical Western world stance. Free agency being, I think, as a society, we should offer a range of experiences, and I'm not too sure that we should force society to say it's just got to be free play, or every academy has to be like the Chelsea Academy, or every academy has to be like this. There is room in society to have a Chelsea Academy. There is also room to have your local soccer, rugby, golf, tennis club where there's free play and not much coaching, or just voluntary coaching or whatever, that young people get to choose a range of experiences, but within that parents need an education process. I don't know if you want to comment on what I've just said, but that's kind of how I perceive it. It's just offering a range of experiences.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably a few avenues we could go down there, none of which I am especially qualified to be able to talk about, particularly with things like early specialisation. I might hold opinions, but it's certainly not an area that I've researched. I would be in support of young people having a range of experiences that are age and stage developmentally appropriate. I'm not necessarily sold on, I think that there's so many throwaway lines that we could have here. Things like "let children be children." I look back in history and think, well, how often, when were children? Was it in the Victorian age? Was it before that? And I'm not sure about those things, but I do know that I would like a generation of people who are equipped to be able to deal with the challenges of the future and to be able to live lives having had a range of experiences. And that's certainly my point of view as a parent.
Absolutely. Let's move on to. I think there was a final. Yes, there was a final mediator, and that's a lack of physical skills. Which seems to be something that my impression would be that coaches work their way towards this most of the time. Oh, well, he just didn't have it physically, or is the technical side incorporated into that?
Well, so far, so we've talked about these characteristics. So the areas that we identified physically, again, it's a very small portion of the group where didn't grow as expected, as in fantastic prospect very early, but just didn't grow to the level of physicality that would be needed in the specific position that person played. That's both football and rugby. There was a specific example in rugby of somebody who was fantastically gifted with the ball, but ultimately was playing a sport with 120 kilo men and just couldn't get themselves above 70 kilos. So there was just too big a barrier there. But ultimately what we're talking about is a bandwidth, and that's and it's a pretty broad bandwidth.
Okay, so what are to conclude here? What were the questions that you came away with from this study?
So I think the key question, and a real problem that talent pathways need to consider is how they look beyond the pitch, the court, the track, and understand that coaching and performance management is a lot more than what you do when you're running around. The process of managing talent development is really significant, and I would suggest that needs really nuanced and careful management. I'm not sure that that's taking place. I speak particularly about a professional male team sports when I say this, not necessarily anywhere else. That I'm not convinced that that's necessarily happening, or that that's systematically either environment is set up to that. That how coaches and how talent environments can be equipped to be able to support the development of psychological factors, given that there's plenty of evidence to suggest that those who do make it have a preponderance of them, and those that don't make it, as per this, don't necessarily. So that's a significant challenge. That the approach and deliberate challenge that should take place during a talent pathway is a very difficult one to manage, not just from the mechanics of putting somebody into something that you might consider difficult, but it's making sure that they are going to be able to cope with the challenge that you put in front of them, and then how effectively you debrief at the end of it. And I suppose more broadly, just a need to focus on failures just as much as successes as a philosophy, rather not just from an academic point of view, but from a talent pathway point of view, a coaching point of view, what hasn't worked in addition to what did work.
If there was my final question, Jamie, if there was one mechanism, so this is a deeply unfair question, but if there was one mechanism that you could put in place or recommend that, say, an academy director or a head coach of an academy could put in place to massage one or more of the areas you've just spoken about, what might that be?
Oh, that's an enormous question.
Yeah.
The simple answer is I don't think there is one. I think that what we're talking about here needs to be approached from multiple angles. Significant part of it comes down to coach education and coach development, and then the internal processes that support the development of psychological skills, and then being embedded in everything that takes place in an academy environment, rather than go to the psych over there.
Great. Yeah, absolutely great. And it sort of fits neatly, as I was asking you that question in my own mind, was the adoption of what one might call a psychologically informed environment, which is understanding that every coaching process, principle and communication put in place has an impact on the psychological element of the organisation and the psychology of each individual, if you like.
Yes, I'd fundamentally agree with that.
Yeah, great. Jamie, fantastic conversation, and it's really, really good to break down a piece of research because as we were talking off there, I think it's something that we need to use these kind of platforms to do so, to bring theory and practice closer together, to scaffold down the language and the ideas for coaches, for practitioners, even for participants at times. So it's really great to talk to you about your paper. I mean, what's next for you? Are you going to be following up this paper with trying to answer the questions that were posed?
So we've got another paper in press at the moment that's pulling together a position on the nature of developmental experiences and their potential and motive effect, and then we've done some longitudinal work with some some athletes in a talent pathway who are progressing to the highest level to look at the coherence of what they're experiencing. So excited to get that out there eventually.
Fantastic. And I know people will be listening and it will tap their interest. If at all possible, how can people get in contact? Do you use social media? What platform might they be able to follow you on and be in contact?
I suppose Twitter is probably the best platform, as it's the only one that I go on. I'm sure you can put up my it's a handle in it.
Yes, it is a handle.
You can put up my handle on the show on the notes. And happy for you to put my email address up there as well if that would help people.
Well, I'll let everybody know it's at JATTAYLOR, Jat Taylor. So I'm sure you'll get some followers after the show. Jamie, thank you so much for joining me today on the Sports Psych Show.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it.
Well, everyone, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me exactly what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you have any suggestions, I'd certainly be delighted to hear them. I'm really looking forward to next week's show. Bye for now.